It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. I am, again, so honored that you are here. I appreciate it very much. The two things you can do, if you like the show, one, go to patreon.com/Phil and contribute to offset some of my costs and time for producing, creating, interviewing, everything in the show. And the other thing, of course, give a 5-star review. I think the only two places that this is commonly done is Stitcher and Apple Podcast Player or Apple Podcast through the internets. Other than that, thank you. I'm glad you're here. Today's show, just chock full of goodness. We are going to have Polaris Plan Part 2. Last episode was Part 1, which was bonds versus stocks, and now I'm going to get into a lot of my thoughts on the bonds, the bond funds that I currently use. And keep in mind, this is late summer of 2020. If you're listening to this a year later, be very, very careful because my opinions and positions may have changed. Of course, any questions that you have about this stuff, you can email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. So again, the Investing Skeptically segment, Polaris Plan Part 2. The interview for today, you're going to love, because I know I love doing it, is a nice long interview with Sarah Posner. Sarah Posner. Sorry, Sarah. Sarah Posner. She is the author of a brand new book called Unholy. And this is all about the history of Trump and religion and racism in America and how they all came together to make this stupid... how they all came together to make Trump president. Her previous book near this subject was in 2008 called God's Prophets. And it's profits as in making money. So she's been a long-time writer/reporter, and she has been in the rooms. She has been in the room when some of this stuff has been said and decided, and this book will crack your head open like an egg in a frying pan. I'm just thinking about those. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on Unholy. You may know some of this stuff already, but how maniacal and devious all of this stuff is and how it's played out over decades now. This is not something Trump came up with. He just happened to fit the suit. He happened to fit the suit of appealing towards racism and pleading or agreeing with Christians and agreeing to do what the extreme right, the moral majority, the Christian evangelicals want him to do, even though he's probably not Christian. But that's a whole nother subject. So you're going to love that interview. The one quick thing I had here that I wanted to throw in, not to make a full Investing Skeptically segment for you, is I have this magazine. What is this thing called here? Investment News. Whatever. Not very creative as a name. It's just one of these newspaper, journals, magazines that I get for free. And I love it because every once in a while they'll send me a thing saying, this is your last notification. If you don't send us this information about you or your business, we're going to stop sending it to you. Yeah. I should be so lucky. They never stop sending me this stuff. And often I don't even read them. But this time I was skimming through it and I found this nice story here that I thought I would share with you about some really, really low-cost index funds. And of course, we know Fidelity had some zero-cost index funds. And a really important thing for everyone to remember is that the published expense ratio of any mutual fund will include all of the expenses that are required by law to be included in the category of expense ratio. That does not mean that that is every possible expense that you might or will pay for the continuing and ongoing operation of that fund. So the fund can make money from your investment other ways that they do not return to you, or they may charge you other fees or have other costs that you pay that are not defined in such a way that they are legally required to include it in the expense ratio. So when you're comparing an expense ratio of 2% versus 0.2% or 90% lower, you're pretty sure that that's a lot lower expense ratio. That's pretty straightforward. And a lot of index funds are 0.1%, 0.7, 0.5, 0.4. And you get to the point of diminishing returns where maybe they're making money somewhere else that hurts your performance, but technically your expense ratio is lower. So it can be too much of a good thing. And, by the time you get to Vanguard index funds, and almost all of them are 0.1% or less, how much more are you going to save? I mean, you can just spend too much time and effort getting it lower for virtually no benefit. Well, one of the great examples I have here in this magazine, and I was like, I got to talk about this. There was a company called Salt Financial, and they came out with an ETF index fund that was expense ratio was so low that they were going to pay you. That's right, not just the returns. They were going to pay you 5 basis points. And just in case we're not clear, 1% expense ratio would be 1 basis point, or would be 100 basis points. Forgive me, 100 basis points is 1%. An expense ratio of 0.1 is 10 basis points. And so sometimes they'll use basis points because it can be a little tricky when a fund makes 10% but then charges 1%. Well, 1% of what? So often they'll say basis points. And so in this case, a Vanguard index fund might be 7 or 8 or 5 or 4 basis points. This one is negative 5 basis points. They give money back to you. Well, it turns out they weren't making any money at this. And so with a vote of a majority of the investors, and or a majority of the investors voting and a majority of the people voting in favor of, after a period of time, the expense ratio went to 0.29% or 29 basis points that you're paying instead of them paying you. And so if you thought getting paid 5 basis points was awesome, well, now you're not getting paid 5 basis points. You're paying 29 basis points or 0.29 or roughly 0.3% expense ratio. Again, still not that high compared to what a lot of mutual funds are, but that's not what you signed up for. And it may have been perfectly clear that the 5 basis points being paid to you was going to end in a year or 6 months if you bought through the process, but you didn't think maybe it was going to go to 0.29. And now this company has had so much trouble making money that apparently this fund is going to be sold to Pacer advisors, whoever they are, I don't know. But apparently the plan, according to this news article, is to go to 60 basis points. Still not particularly high compared to managed funds, but this is basically an index fund. And so instead of paying 5 to 10 basis points, you'll now be paying 60 basis points or 0.6 of 1%. So, be careful what you buy. And sometimes it really is a marketing gimmick, and the marketing gimmick can come back and get you. And the problem, of course, here is that sure, you're in this fund and you could say, well, great, I'm in this fund. I'm going to sell this fund and now go buy a Vanguard index fund, which is probably a good idea. But if the market's been up, which it has been, with the exception of a couple of months in the spring of 2020, you've made money and now you're going to have to pay taxes to liquidate this position and put it somewhere where the expense ratio is lower. Is that a good thing to do? I don't know. You're going to have to look at the math. You're going to have to check with your tax consultant. But that's a little thing from that magazine, I guess we'll call it. And that wraps up the intro segment. And it was a little longer, but I thought you would really like that negative expense ratio story and how things aren't always as good as they seem. So be careful There's often tricks and traps out there, people wanting to separate you from your money and prevent you from getting to the point where you have your everlasting nest egg. I kind of think of that Willy Wonka, the everlasting gobstopper. So instead of candy that lasts forever, you want to get to the point where your nest egg lasts forever, the everlasting nest egg. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to go into the Investing Skeptically official segment, the Polaris Plan Part 2, and then the interview with Sarah Posner. After all of that, you're going to love this show.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This Investing Skeptically segment is basically Polaris, the Polaris Plan, Part 2, I guess. Previously, we did Part 1, which covered the most fundamental, most foundational, basic, important decision that you have to make is what part of your money is in stocks versus what part is in bonds. And, of course, if you need a very small amount out of your portfolio, or if your intentions are to leave as much money as possible to either charities or your descendants, of course, having the majority of your money in stock is what you want to do. That's your bias. You want to have more stocks than bonds, definitely. If the money you have is not really enough, if you need to take out maybe more than you should, and you want to make sure that it's there for you to spend down until you run out, ironically, a more conservative approach is probably the way to go. And in Part 1, I talked about how to figure that out. And it's based on, for me, it's based on your financial needs, your budget, not necessarily your age, but maybe the years to retirement, and some basic guidelines to recap. If you're 62 or below, taking out 4% of your portfolio per year is probably a good starting point, a good strategy position. 60 to 65, and yes, I know there's an overlap. These are not rigid rules, but 60 to 65, maybe 66, 5% might be reasonable. Late 60s, early 70s, 6%, and of course, late 70s, maybe even 7%, and in your 80s, getting close to 80, maybe 8% of your portfolio is okay. If you want to spend more of the money and you don't want to give the money away or pass it on to your heirs. As an example, if you are 80 and taking out 8% of your portfolio, you could do that for 10, 11, 12-ish years if your portfolio makes nothing. And that gets you to 92. Hopefully your portfolio is making 4 or 5%. And of course, that means you're probably in your mid to late 90s. If you live that long, I don't expect that I will. Most people don't. I think it was something like 1% of people live past 99 or 96, something like that. So you're getting up to where you're pretty much covered, and it's okay if you run out of money if you take the view that, you had 96 good years. Who cares if I'm broke at the end? But that may not be the way you want to go. So 8% could be too high even for someone who starts at 80. But, it's all about the mathematics of it all. So assuming you've got that part figured out, and if you're lost at this point, go back and re-listen to the Polaris Plan Part 1 in the previous episode. If that is not clear, that means I've failed. You should contact me and let me know. And maybe I can clarify, fix, or whatever. Or, if you just want to have a personal conversation, you and me, about your situation, we can do that as well. Again, to do that, you can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. All I ask is that you send your phone number. And you can send some details about your situation, but it's always weird because if I send back an email, sometimes there was a piece of information you didn't tell me, or there was a piece of information I didn't read right, or I didn't understand correctly, and I can give a suboptimal response. So I really like the interpersonal connectedness of voice by phone. So that's why I do like the phone number. If you get what you need from that phone call, that chat, that's cool. If something needs a follow-up and you want to send me documents after we've talked, we can do that. Of course, I do this all free, knowing that the vast majority of people that take advantage of this are never going to hire me. But I also know that a small percentage of people do hire me. And so that's kind of the weird business model that I started out always just giving out information and trying to teach people, just like this show segment. It's all free. I'm not doing a bait and switch. I'm not teasing you maybe a little bit here for a few minutes, but I'm going to give you all the information you need. You will have everything you need. You don't need to hire me, but you may choose to do so. And it seems to work. So I'm going to keep doing that strategy because that's what I want to do. So today we're going to talk about the portion of your portfolio that I call the cushion. Generally, I look at stocks and bonds. I know it's really boring, but the shit works. So I don't want to get too creative. And of course, right now, and just like every other moment in time, a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you can look at some different, sometimes new, but sometimes old type of investment or a place to put your money that made more money than the stock market, made more money than bonds. And you can look at that and you can say, well, shit, if 2 years ago I had done X, I would have all this money. That's great. Did you know that 2 years ago? You didn't. That's why you didn't invest in it. So don't beat yourself up too bad. There's all kinds of places you can put your money, including betting on red or black at a roulette table. You just don't know in advance what is going to win. And so you can take some exceedingly high risks and win sometimes, but a lot of times you can take exceedingly high risks and lose. And so one of the foundations of my philosophy is try to make a reasonably safe, a reasonably secure, a reasonable amount of money, a reasonable amount of the time, and following this, really boring, slow and steady, like the rabbit and the hare. The rabbit and the hare, tortoise and the hare. The tortoise and the hare, the turtle wins. Just slow and steady. It can sometimes be painfully boring, but it works. So that's why I do it for myself and for my clients. One of the greatest things I've ever achieved in my life is learning to listen to my own advice of being slow and steady, staying the course, and not trying to think that I can outsmart the market, because I've proven that I can't. So the trick is to not do that. And we are now in the summer of 2020, and people ask me all the time, why is the market going up when so many people are unemployed? They're not literally directly connected. And if a lot of people think the economy is going to survive coronavirus and Trump, then prices will go up. when more people buy and fewer people sell, prices will go up. Question is, what will it do the next 12 months? I have no idea. What will it do the next 20 years? I have a pretty good idea based on history that it's going to be higher than it is today. Anyway, the part that's in the cushion, the bonds, we're going to, let me just assume it's 30% of your portfolio. You have $1 million portfolio. You're, in your 60s, early 60s or mid 60s, and you want to take out 5% of your portfolio. And we're going to have 30% of the portfolio in bonds, in the cushion. Now, this may be too little or too much for your personal situation. This is not, as the little warning advisory thing says, this is not personalized investment advice for you, dear listener. Just some ideas giving us a reference point of what to discuss. The nice thing about the cushion is that it's slow and steady. Talking about that tortoise versus the hare. It's the slowest and steadiest part. It's generally not going to make a whole lot, and it's generally not going to lose a whole lot, although there are exceptions. But it's meant to be there in case the stock market falls for a year or two or 4 or 5. Almost always, even going back to 1900 and the Great Depression, if you include dividends, and especially if you include inflation or back then deflation in the 30s, the stock market fully recovers every single time in about 7 years, or wildly less, like this time last March, in a few weeks. Doesn't have to be that way. I don't know what will happen the next time, and probably the closest big exception to this over the last 120 years was 2000 and then 2008. Yes, by 2008, the stock market had fully recovered, but then it fell again. If you were balancing your fund, you pretty much were okay. But if you kept pulling out bond money and then got hit again in 2008, it could have been kind of tight, which is why I normally build the cushion to last 10 to 12 is my normal historical range. Right now it's 12 to 14 years. So even in that case, from 2000 up to 2014, when the market was doing very nicely again after the 08 fall, you still had enough bonds and dividends to get through and wait for the stock market to come back, because you don't want to sell low. That's, everyone knows, buy low, sell high. So in the cushion, the 30%, I am not going to break down these percentages in detail, but right now I'm kind of using, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 6 bond funds. And I'm going to give them to you in order from most conservative, i.e. safest, to most risky. And the two most conservative are, and these are all Vanguard index bond funds. You can probably find most of these in other places. Fidelity, Schwab, T. Rowe Price, whatever big names that you know, they probably have something close to this. And you want to look for funds that have expense ratios of around 0.1% or less. Funds that are too low, like 0, can be kind of gimmicky, and there may be a possibility they're getting money from somewhere else. So something to be thinking about. But the two that I use right now mostly, and you don't have to use these two, but it's the idea. Short-term government bond fund, the Admiral shares, which is the really low expense ratio. It takes $3,000 to get in. The symbol for that, the 5 letters, VBIRX. Victor, Bravo, Indigo, Robert, Xylophone. I don't know what the right words to use are, but you get the idea. Another one that you can use is the short-term corporate bond fund, also very high quality and very short-term. That's VFSUX. And so those two funds, I'll go ahead and give you the third one, is VFIJX. VFIJX, that's the Jenny May fund that is based on home loans that are backed by the government. And those 3 funds, the first 3 that I mentioned, are the core of the most boringest part of the boringest part of your portfolio. They're going to make, going forward, one can expect 1 to 2% per year. Now, in the past years, they've made considerably more than that, 4, 5, 6%, because interest rates have gone down. I did not expect interest rates to go down. Anyone who listens to the show a year or 2 ago heard me warning about interest rates going up. But they either stayed flat or went down. And I didn't anticipate a president coming in and trying to put on tariffs and encouraging the Fed so earnestly, and maybe even requiring the Fed to lower interest rates to keep the economy humming along. So, we maybe missed out on an opportunity with the longer bonds, but this is the really safe stuff. Also available, and I am currently not recommending, although ironically, if you look at the 1-year performance, they look fantastic, are called intermediate or long-term bond funds. So there's this thing for date to maturity, or even better measure that's more accurate is called duration. And duration will tell you how sensitive that fund is to interest rate fluctuations. So if a fund has a duration, and you can, look up any fund on Morningstar.com. If it's a bond fund, it will probably, like 99% of the time, have a duration number. If that duration number is 3, what that tells you is that if interest rates go down by 1%, that fund is likely to go up 3%. So that's very cool. So the fund might actually only have a dividend of 1%, let's just say, to make it really low. But if interest rates fall closer to 0, you could get the 1% plus 3% upside because your bonds are more valuable than the new bonds that pay less. Keep in mind, it works in the other direction as well. If the duration is 3 and interest rates go up by 1%, the value of your bond fund could go down by 3%. So if you're in a bond fund that has a 1% yield, and then it drops in value by 3% because of depreciation of the value of the assets, you could lose 3% and make 1% for a net of -2. Still not a big loss, but that is how that works. With intermediate and long-term bonds, I'm assuming still we're talking about really high quality bonds, particularly U.S. government bonds that are most sensitive to this. You can get bond funds that have durations of 10, 12, 15, 20 or more, which means they own a lot of really long-term bonds. The problem is that while a long-term bond fund might not pay 1%, it might pay 3%, which, just looking at 3% versus 1%, it's a no-brainer. Pick the 3%. If it has a duration of 20 and interest rates go up 1 point, the value of the bonds collectively held in this mutual fund could fall by 20%. So you could make 3 in yield and lose 20% in valuation for a net drop of 17%. For me at this time, that defeats the whole purpose of the cushion, because I don't want to have an investment in the cushion that could lose 17% if interest rates go up. I want the stuff in the cushion to be safe, which is why I use short-term government as an example, VBIRX, short-term corporate, again from Vanguard Index Funds, high-quality fund, VFSUX, and the Jenny May Fund, VFIJX. And all 3 of these are very highly rated, A or above. A, AA, AAA is the top rated. You want really quality bonds. You can get dramatically higher interest rates or yields from bonds if you get really risky bonds. And so the next 3 bonds, again, still in order of increasing volatility or riskiness. One is, so the first 3 that I mentioned, I want them to be the bulk of your bonds. 2/3, 3/4, 80%, maybe 85% of your bonds should be those 3 funds. Really lame and really boring. Other times in the past, and I'm sure at other points in the future, I will also recommend intermediate and long-term bonds when we're in a situation where interest rates may go up or may go down. But right now, I was wrong last year. I was wrong 2 years ago. So what do I know? But interest rates are at their new all-time historic lows, and unless we start dabbling around with negative interest rates, which have not been successful in other countries, interest rates at some point will go up, and those longer-term funds can take a serious whack. So those 3 that I'm recommending are really boring, really safe. The 3 bond funds that probably should be, each one of them maybe 5, maybe 10%. And that would give you, these 3 funds would get you 30% of your bond portfolio, keeping 70% or more in the really safe stuff, can give you a little extra oomph. And with a little extra oomph comes a little extra holy shit when things don't work your way. And these 3 funds are the Total International Bond Fund, VTABX, and then Emerging Market Bond Fund, which is all international but from smaller developing countries. And that one is called, that symbol is VGAVX. And then the last one is Junk Yield, or High Junk. Oh my God, I can't do English. High Yield, also known as junk bonds. And the bond fund, the index fund from Vanguard is VWEAX. So a total of 6 funds. The first 3 are the bulk, 2/3, 3/4, 80% of your bonds. Of course, you can also have some money in cash. That can be part of the cushion. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. That's the most conservative part of your cushion is cash. And that might be, depending on what you have locally in your bank, 3, 6, or even 12 months of your cash flow, what you need to take out. So if you're taking out $2,000 a month, you could have 6 months of supply, or $12,000, or $24,000, something like that in cash. And these 3 other bond funds are the more riskier ones. They could make 4 or 5% per year for several years going forward. And the neat thing is that they probably aren't as affected by changes in interest rates as the 3 really conservative funds, because these aren't as high a quality of bonds. So bonds that are lower quality, the interest rate is higher because you're taking a greater risk. And so when interest rates change, that change may not be as material as the risk that you're already taking. And so interest rate changes may not negatively affect riskier bonds. So one of the things I recommend to people, and I've had people send me a sample statement of their portfolio, and they have half of their money in bonds, so it's 50% stocks, 50% bonds. But when I look at the bond portfolios and I pull them up on Morningstar.com, I should get like a referral fee from them. I do not get any money from them. You can look up your bond funds, and again, the top tier is AAA, then AA, then A, then BBB. Double B and below is generally considered not investment grade, not high quality, and junk bond funds. And so those funds, those bonds, pay more interest. And often I run into the situation where people will think, why get a 2% bond when I can get a bond that pays 8%? And if you know nothing else about bonds, of course, 8% bigger than 2%. In a fund with higher risk bonds, keep in mind that 8% yield, you will only get all of that 8% if every single bond in the fund actually pays 100% of the dividends that it's promised. Some of them will not. And if a small percentage, let's say 4 or 5% of those bonds default and not only don't pay the dividends, but they end up being tied to a company or an organization that goes into bankruptcy, you might not even get the principal part back. So if 5% of all the high yield junk bonds collapse to 0, you lost 5% of your portfolio. So even if you get 8% interest from everybody else, you could still net out just 3% because 5% of the portfolio went to 0. And it's one of those things where people will I'll talk to people and I'll say, do you have a home loan? And most people right now, hopefully, if you're listening to this show, you're paying something around 4% or less. If I recommend that you go refinance your home and now go get a 9% loan from your bank to pay the mortgage on your home, you would think that I'm insane, because there's no way in the world you're going to pay 9% when you could pay 4%. Well, corporations and other organizations are kind of the same way. If they put a bond out there and they can sell those bonds and pay 3%, they're not going to pay 4%. If they need to charge 4%, they're not going to pay 5%. If they need to charge 6% to take care of the risk, they're not going to willingly pay 8%. So companies that are issuing bonds, junk bonds that are paying 8 or 9 or 10% yield, somebody somewhere knows that they have to pay that much interest, otherwise no one would buy the bonds. So you're engaging in significant risk. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but if one half of your portfolio is in bonds because you're scared of stock market volatility, which you might be rightly saying to give that consideration, you've replaced high volatility stocks with high volatility bonds. You have not actually done what you thought you did. So we had this year a situation in March of 2020 where some junk bond funds went down 25, 35, even 40% in a few weeks. And I got phone calls from people going, what happened? I have bond funds, right? I have bond funds. I have safe bond funds. And when the stock market went down, so did my bond funds. Because you have junk bonds. You have a lot of junk bonds that are tied to high-risk companies that are at a reasonable chance of failing and completely collapsing and going bankrupt. But most of the stocks have come back, and most of the stock junk bonds have come back. But it was a warning sign to you, a very, very clear and very loud warning signal to you. If a large portion of your cushion, of your bonds, are junk bonds, whether they're bought individually or in bond funds, you should take this glorious opportunity to go in and fucking fix it. Another thing I see often is people in bonds will buy individual bonds. This one bond here, this one bond here, this one bond there. Like with stock picking, you can do better than a mutual fund if you are that 1% cream of the crop and you know everything about buying and trading bonds. That's probably not you. You wouldn't listen to the show because you'd be bored out of your mind because you know way more than me. So picking individual bonds can actually be more risky than picking individual stocks. There's all kinds of ways that bonds can be tricky, from being able to be called or recalled, to conversions, to interest rates, to flexible rates. What are the bonds tied to? Is it tied to the U.S. government's ability to print more money and pay you? Is it tied to a bridge that if it doesn't collect enough toll money, you're just not going to get all your money back? That's just the way it works. Or a building or a factory? Or did the company just say, we promise we're going to pay you back, and you get nothing else other than their promise? Well, how valuable is their promise? All of that can be very, very tricky. Another thing with buying individual bonds, if you are using a broker-dealer, if the broker-dealer helps you buy a bond and you use their platform or their an employee to go buy a bond, they will charge you a brokerage fee. It might be $5, it might be $100, whatever. But if they own those bonds, if your advisor, and I have air quotes up, your non-fiduciary commission-based, commission-based advisor calls you and says, hey, I've got an opportunity for you to buy this 8% bond. If you do not demand for them to clarify, you can ask them, are you selling these to me as a broker or as the dealer? When they sell it to you as the dealer, it means they already own that bond. They may actually be underwriting that bond. They may be helping the corporation to get that bond out to the public, out to you. And there can be all kinds of special secret deals and trades that you may not know, and you may not ever be able to know how much is the dealer making on convincing you to buy that bond. Very, very big profits can be made here by the dealer. Note, not by you. So if you buy a bond, are they making 5% or 20%? Will they disclose it to you? If you don't ask, they're not going to, probably. If you ask, the person suggesting it may not be able to. I think they're supposed to be able to, but it may not be disclosed. So buying individual bonds, especially when someone recommends it, and this applies to a lot of things like preferred stocks and all kinds of different investment products. Recently, someone asked me about, what are they called? Structured notes, all kinds of weird things. And this is why the industry likes to promote a lot of these. And this is why a lot of these I do not like, because they get so complicated. It's nearly impossible for you to understand all the details involved. So, in summary, the portion of the portfolio that is the safe stuff, the cushion. You can have some cash, which might be 3 to 12 months of what you need out on a monthly basis, just depending on how conservative you want to be and how much maybe you have in your bank and how much flexibility you could have. Because if you could stop taking cash out for 2 or 3 months, you don't need as much cash. And then the 3 primary funds that I use at this time, Vanguard short-term government VBIRX, short-term corporate VFSUX, and Jenny May VFIJX, and the 3 in small doses that are considerably more risky: Total International VTABX, emerging market bonds VGAVX, and junk bonds, which is mostly U.S. based, at least in the Vanguard Index Fund, VWEAX. So hopefully those 6 funds give you some diversification and volatility reduction and the ability to pull out and sell those things if the stock market goes down. So that wraps up part 2, the Polaris plan, I guess. Polaris plan part 2.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world, millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate. Only the unloved hate. The unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery. Fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man. Not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power. The power to create machines. The power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful. To make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world. A decent world. That will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason. A world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship.
If you support the Catholic Church, isn't that like the same thing as being an R. Kelly fan?
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back. And as promised, today's superstar interviewee is Sarah Posner. She is a writer about religion and politics, two of my favorite things. And she has a brand new book, which I just finished, called Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship the... Oh, my God. I don't even have the right page up. Hang on a second. At the altar of Donald Trump. See, that suspense made it better. Sarah, how are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good. I kind of had to detox after going through this book. It had a lot of stuff that I knew about, but a lot of stuff I didn't know about. And the historical layout of everything was absolutely delightful. And we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, because now I've got the listeners teased. They can't wait. Tell us about you. Only share what you want, your history, your background, who you work for, how long you've been doing this, and all the amazing stuff that you do.
So right now, I am a reporting fellow with Type Investigations, which is an investigative newsroom that's part of the Type Media Center, which used to be known as the Nation Institute. I don't know if people might have heard of it that way. My work has been published all over the place because at Type we partner with other publications. So I've written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, HuffPost, Mother Jones, The Nation, The New Republic, lots of different publications. And I've been doing this for about 15 years. Before that, I was a lawyer. And Unholy is my second book.
And I'm delighted you took us there. What was the first book?
The first book was God's Prophets, spelled Prosits. And it was about the Republican Party's relationship with prosperity gospel televangelists.
Absolutely delightful. And I may have to go back and do that book because, like I said to you before we started recording, you do the topics that I talk about almost every week. And I just felt awful that I didn't know who you were until we got to this new book. So, but at least, we finally got there. It's never too late. That's right. It's never too late. I learn new things. I think my last episode, I just had to issue a big correction about something I had wrong because I learn new things all the time. You have been not just studying this, paying attention to this, following this. You have actually been on site, in situ, I guess, on location. When some of these events have actually happened, you were physically there. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, that's what I do as a reporter.
Yeah.
I used to before there was a pandemic.
Right.
Yes. So I've been to churches and conferences and political rallies and all sorts of events where this kind of political organizing and political mobilizing takes place. And so a lot of the book is reported from these kinds of events, but also, events that were hosted by white supremacists and the alt-right, and also just, interviews with various people along the way.
And this, of course, is not my first book on this subject that I've read or had read to me via an audiobook, but I love the firsthand, from a historical perspective. You're not just writing about what people told you, you're writing about being there. And one of the things I find common when I talk to people about Trump is that they're worried that this environment that created him, came up in 2016 or 2015, or it's 5 or 10 years old. But according to your book, I don't think that's a new thing. This has been a long time coming. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Excellent.
So Trump is, to think about it in a shorthand way, Trump is not an aberration, but rather a culmination.
I like it. I've also told people that Trump is the symptom of the problem, not the cause of the problem. But
right.
Same kind of thing. When does this go back to? Does this go back to 2005? He knows knowingly that I'm going to bait you to go back even further. When do you think this kind of starts?
So the book goes back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, when a group of political operatives in Washington, D.C. began putting together what we now know as the modern conservative movement. So the historical section of the book focuses on Paul Weyrich, who was one of the leading architects of the religious right. Now, obviously, there's always been a religious right in the United States, but the modern religious right was something that was pulled together in the 1970s. Its first successful organization was the Moral Majority, and Weyrich was instrumental in pulling that together. Now, Weyrich was also an architect of what was then known as the New Right, and this was an effort to create a right-wing movement that was focused on what they perceived to be the needs and desires of your average white Christian middle America person. And Weyrich, he did that, but he was also a key player in making conservative white evangelicals and Catholics a very key component of this new coalition that he was putting together.
And a lot of it is over this perceived hurt, this idea that they're persecuted, that especially the white men are being stripped of their power, and any reduction in power they perceive as abuse. They perceive as their rights are being taken away from being number one. So this is 50 plus years, and not uncoincidentally, well, it's related to civil rights, and it's also related to desegregation of schools and Christian schools. And I'd love for you to talk on that for a minute or two.
Sure. So most people think that the driving force for the Christian right in the 1970s was the Supreme Court's decision in 1973 in Roe v. Wade legalizing abortion. But by Weyrich's own admission, he could not get evangelicals and fundamentalists animated about that issue as much as it animated him and his fellow conservative Catholics. So the issue that really did propel them into national electoral politics was the efforts of the federal government to ensure that the promise of desegregation in public schools was also carried out in private schools. And so one of the first things that the federal government did in this regard was to remove the tax-exempt status for Bob Jones University, which is a fundamentalist college in South Carolina, which at the time banned interracial dating on campus. And because of this racist policy, the Internal Revenue Service revoked Bob Jones University's tax-exempt status. At the same time, there was various lawsuits and policy changes coming from the federal courts and the IRS about private K through 12 schools, some of which had explicitly segregationist policies, and they lost their tax-exempt status. But then there were others that were Christian schools that did not have an explicit discriminatory admissions policy, but were nonetheless mostly white. And so the IRS tried to get them to change their admissions policies in order to have more non-white students in their schools. The reasoning being we have this national, it's the law now that schools cannot be public schools cannot be segregated. So you can't use your tax exemption, which is basically a subsidy from the taxpayers, to essentially be segregated in your private school. Well, there was a great outcry against that because the Christian school administrators and principals and leaders portrayed that as an infringement of their religious freedom by the federal government, which was meddling in their religious affairs. And one of the leaders of the K through 12 Christian school movement ultimately introduced Weyrich to Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, and became the first executive director of the Moral Majority. His name was Bob Billings.
And so in this case, and I think I'm going to try to be an outside observer, although I probably can't be, but the schools were losing their tax-exempt status because they were not complying with the morals and the ethics of the country as a whole, that schools should be integrated.
Well, the law.
With the
law, too.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So it said, okay, we're not going to make you stop being racist. We're just not going to give you a tax perk, a big tax perk, a lot of tax perks to be racist. Go be racist if you want to be. We're not even saying that you can't. We're just saying we're not going to fund it. We're not going to give you a special perk.
Exactly. And with the Christian schools, they hadn't lost the tax-exempt status. They were facing the possibility, if they didn't take these very sort of basic steps to try to increase the numbers of black students attending their school. So it wasn't like...
Right. They weren't mandated. It was just, here's some things that you have to say that you're going to try to do. Does that seem fair?
That you should, yes. Well, they were, some of them were not you should say, you should try to do, but that you should do, right? But they were very minimal, right? So the goal was to have a certain percentage of your student body be a percentage of the minority population in the community in which the school was located. So it was kind of like a bare minimum, and it wasn't a quota, although they tried to portray it that way. So, the IRS was encouraging them to do things like recruit more minority teachers and go out into the community and try to recruit more students to apply for admission to your school, or play intramural sports with schools with a bigger minority population than your school. It was not, these were not onerous requirements, but it was portrayed as the big bad federal government trying to impose these radical ideas on our religious schools.
So 50 plus years ago, it was about race, or at least partially about race and taxes. And today, even though they try to dodge it and pretend like it's not, it's often a lot about race and of course, taxes. And this drives the politics. You had mentioned one of my other pet favorite topics is that abortion, people think that the religious right grew up and was born when the vote for Roe v. Wade occurred, but that didn't happen. How did that ever become a thing?
So the abortion was opposed by many conservative Catholics like Weyrich. And so it was already a thing even before Roe v. Wade amongst these conservative Catholics. It was not a really big issue for a lot of evangelicals, and the Southern Baptist Convention, which at the time was the largest evangelical denomination in the country, they were pro-choice. But over the course of the 1970s, even though they were getting these evangelicals and fundamentalists involved in politics over the school segregation issue, they were also encouraging them to get involved over the abortion issue, right? And so these things were happening simultaneously, and there were activists like Francis Schaeffer, who traveled the country with a movie that he showed to evangelicals, telling that basically, portrayed abortion as this very evil, moral sin that they had to get involved and become what he called co-belligerents with Catholics over. And so there were concerted efforts to involve them on the abortion issue, and over time it became not just a top litmus test issue for them in politics, like asking Supreme Court nominees or presidential candidates whether they oppose abortion or not, but also it's kind of a lodestar for what it means to be a Christian in their view, like that you cannot be a Christian if you support abortion rights. Yeah,
so that all pulls together, and these stories, it just keeps building, and it's funny because often evangelicals deny evolution, but you can look at these organizations and how they evolved. If a topic didn't bring in money, didn't bring in power, they would drop it and they would shift to something else, and they would shift to another thing, and they would spin things and create things. And they, when they got past the 70s and into the 80s, what were the next things that they were trying to do?
Well, so religious freedom, as it was framed in the context of the school tax exemption issue, still hangs over everything. It is the key umbrella issue for them. So Bob Jones University is still invoked today by religious right activists as a shorthand for the government is out to get us and suppress our religious freedom or take our religious freedom away entirely, or even in the more overheated rhetoric, criminalize Christianity. So, for example, when the Supreme Court made marriage equality the law of the land in Obergefell in 2015, that was the sort of that was the fear that the religious right tried to instill in the base, that now that same-sex marriage is legal, the tax-exempt status of religious organizations who oppose same-sex marriage is going to be taken away, or the government is going to shut us down because now the Supreme Court has ruled this, and so that necessarily means that our religious freedom is going to be infringed. And that obviously didn't happen, just like it didn't happen really to the K through 12 private schools either.
Right.
And but it remains this measure of how civil rights for some people necessarily mean a violation of religious freedom for Christians.
And I guess it's not too much of a surprise that this ends up with us having Betsy DeVos. Do you know much about her? Have you studied her?
Well, a little bit, but one of the things that she's very much in favor of is private schools, private religious schools, and vouchers for taxpayer-funded vouchers for students to attend private religious schools. And this is another permutation of the idea that the public school system is the enemy of religion, or the enemy of what's, right and just in their version of Christian America. And therefore, it is the duty of the government, as run by Bible-believing Christians, to provide this option for Christian families who think that the public school system is against them.
Excellent. Now, the other thread that you had in there is Russia. And at some point, Russia becomes involved. And for me, and maybe the average listener, that seems to be, 2016, 2015, maybe a few years before that. But when did they really start dabbling in American politics?
So, for anyone who was alive and sentient during the Cold War, of course, the Soviet Union was the great enemy of the United States.
They were the ultimate boogeyman.
Right, and that was very much true on the Christian right. I mean, communism was seen as antithetical to Christianity
Indeed.
and a threat to Christian America. So the idea that after the fall of communism, that post-Soviet Russia would be like a shining light for the American right seems counterintuitive. But for the American right, someone like Putin's gestures towards the idea of Russia having a history as a nation rooted in Christianity or some kind of Christian nationalism is very appealing to them. And Putin's crackdown on LGBTQ rights and promotion of the Russian Orthodox Church signals to them that perhaps, America has lost its way by allowing LGBTQ rights and same-sex marriage. And maybe we should be looking at some of these other countries like Russia or Hungary, where the country's leader has talked about the country's Christian roots in a way that liberals in America have not and have even subverted.
Right. So their views on Christianity drive a new appreciation of the authoritarian leader of Russia and Hungary, and that you mentioned specifically in the book, and that they were getting shit done from their perspective to protect their way of life and impose their thoughts and beliefs onto the population.
And they do like the authoritarianism in particular when it's done to push back on what they portray as gender ideology. That's their catchphrase for LGBTQ rights or reproductive rights or women's rights. And so they like the idea of an authoritarian or autocratic leader taking steps to diminish that kind of ideology in their view, because they believe that has spread like wildfire around the world and is a real danger to the family and the Christian family in particular.
Yeah, when you say the family, of course, I think of the book. Oh, I think you interviewed with your friend. I can't remember his name now. Jeff Charlotte. Yeah. I think I saw a YouTube video with you and him together, and I was like, wow, this is two of my favorites now together in one YouTube video. So listeners, check that out. The family is what again?
So the family is an organization in D.C. that provides, this is not something I look at in my book at all. This is Jeff's book. And it is basically sort of a secretive organization for Washington's powerful to come together and pray together and make policy together.
Yeah, so it's a complete destruction of the wall of separation, right?
Well, so, I mean, that's being done in many different ways. That's
right.
One way in which it happens, as Jeff chronicles in his book.
Yeah, so they would like that. So, again, Russia, when did Russia start dabbling? Was this when the wall came down under Reagan, or was it before that? And when have they started to flex this muscle of uniting authoritarian control and Christianity?
Well, so there are hints of it back in the 90s and early 2000s when Weyrich started going to Russia and making political friends over there. And also an organization that I talk about in the book, the International Organization for the Family, which runs this almost annual conference, the World Congress of Families. It also has played a big role in promoting autocratic pushback against liberal democracy and international human rights by portraying these autocratic leaders as great champions of both family values and Christian nationalism.
And that syncs with my concern that anytime I hear a group that uses the word family in it, I'm scared because that's like it's like the safe word. I can say family. No one objects to family. No one objects to family.
Object to family. Exactly.
Right. And so I will give conservatives / Republicans credit that they are way better at naming shit. Because often liberals will name things for what they actually will do. And conservatives use this, dystopian, Orwellian. Yes, they use this Orwellian nomenclature where whenever they want to take rights away, they call it a rights bill. Or when they want to cut taxes for the rich, they'll say that everyone's going to pay less in taxes. They're much better at naming.
They call abortion. They want fetuses to have civil rights, and they call abortion the most crucial civil rights issue of our time. Now, I don't know how you can look at what is happening in the United States of America right now and say that abortion is the most critical civil rights issue of our time, meaning the civil rights of the fetus are being denied. But they do take a phrase and turn it over for their own use.
Well, and I think
by using the term civil rights in that context.
Yeah, for the vast majority of the last 50 years, you could say that you're anti-abortion, and you can do that out in public without great scorn and mockery and harassment, but you couldn't come out and say that blacks need to stay in their place until recently. And if you were to say something like that, you would be shunned. You would have a hard time collecting money. You couldn't get publicity. But now it feels like to me, I have lost multiple friends, air quotes, friends on Facebook, and several family members from social media, because they now suddenly feel liberated, and they actually, I think they've had these thoughts before, but they knew to never say them out loud. And now they feel liberated to say these horrible things out loud. Does that kind of all tie into this too, or am I putting too much together?
Well, I do think that is the Trump effect.
Yeah.
Because he is the president of the United States, and he has made it okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not okay, right?
Yeah,
but
clearly.
He's made it, in some people's eyes, okay to say those kinds of things. People do feel more liberated to say it, but this was always simmering under the surface, right? Because in the book, I talk about how the conservative movement has consistently had pundits or politicians or political operatives who went too far, right, in saying something racist or nativist, and they had to get fired from their job or, shunted away somewhere because they were bad PR for the movement or bad PR for the Republican Party. But it's kind of like this whack-a-mole effect, right? Because it's like it's always been there and it's always there. And I think what happened with Trump is he and this is borne out in the interviews I did with the white nationalists and white supremacists for the book, is he liberated them. He liberated people to say these, to feel like they could say these things publicly, or to show up at a protest wearing a white nationalist or white power insignia, or whatever the expression was, whether it was, in a sign or an insignia or in a spoken statement, that Trump made it okay again after they had been oppressed by political correctness to not be able to say these things.
Yeah, it's absolutely staggering. And I think you would agree with this, that if we have a new president this fall, a.k.a. January or whatever, the problem doesn't go away. It's still there, and it's partially hidden, partially not hidden. And Trump may have his problems, but they'll find someone else, right? Is that what they're going to do?
Well, I think the other thing that you need to keep in mind is that obviously Trump is not the only exemplar for them, that he has particular I don't know if I'd call them political talents as much as sort of entertainment,
right? Marketing, promotional
instinct, right? That has made his presidency unique. But he certainly isn't the only politician in our public life right now who holds these views or would promote, say, Bill Barr sending stormtroopers to American cities to arrest people on the streets for expressing their First Amendment rights, right? So, but the other thing to keep in mind is this is a movement that very much activates itself or becomes more energized by their backlash moment, right? So if Trump were to lose, especially if he lost narrowly,
right,
but even if he lost by a large margin, that they're so steeped in these grievances and conspiracy theories about the deep state and fake news and George Soros out to get Trump, that they would spend the entirety of a potential Biden presidency manufacturing conspiracy theories, claiming that Trump, that Biden's presidency wasn't legitimate, that Trump was forced out of office illegitimately, and they have a very substantial media and social media ecosystem in which these claims and falsehoods would get amplified and recycled. So I don't think that there is any reason for people to be either complacent about Biden winning, despite what the polls tell you, and there's certainly, even if he does win, there's no reason to be complacent about this movement going away and, picking up their toys and going home.
Yeah.
That is certainly not what they're going to do.
Because I know that for 8 years, the conservative movement and conservative media sure had a controversy every day with Obama, whether it was a tan suit or eating a hot dog or whatever, nonsensical thing. I don't imagine they're going to ask for Biden's birth certificate or claim that he's a Muslim, but who knows?
Well, right, and a lot of it will focus on Ukraine,
yes,
because they've been pushing that since the Russia investigation and since it became apparent that Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee. So, yeah, they're locked and loaded for the next phase.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's any other way of you can't delude yourself into thinking that they would be chastened by a Trump loss.
Yeah, when Biden wins, it's a sigh of relief. Take a shot of Fireball, enjoy the moment for a little bit, but then get back to work. Which I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but if someone is concerned about the alt-right, if someone is concerned about Christian nationalism, white supremacy, love for Russia, which I think kind of all get clumped together in my head, and correct me if I'm wrong there, what should one do to promote liberal values and fairness and democracy across the United States? How can we help?
Well, I mean, obviously everybody has different skills and talents.
Right.
And, people, there's lots of different things that people can do, from talking to their friends and neighbors to getting involved in politics to, I'm very skeptical of social media. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, if my aunt or my grandma is getting 1,000 Ben Shapiro Facebook posts pushed to her every day, I'm going to try to counteract those with my own Facebook posts.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a fool's errand, because Facebook's algorithm is going to crush you.
Yeah.
Crush your posts.
I've tried that. Go ahead. It's like you said, it's not really my area of expertise, how to do that sort of thing. But, I do think that anecdotally more people are getting involved in politics or getting involved in peaceful protesting and that sort of thing. I mean, what's at stake here is our democracy. Right.
So, I think everyone needs to figure out what they want their own role to be in protecting it.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can go wrong or cause problems, from not taxing the wealthy to gerrymandering to games with the voting systems and restricting voting to a short period of time, so people that maybe have a harder go at life can't leave work to go vote, so that they're kind of excluded, or the trivialization of what can make you go to jail and therefore lose your rights to votes in some states. It just seems like they're trying to kill us with a death from 1,000 cuts kind of process. Any little thing they can nick away at their opponents, they're going to take it.
Right, because they know that demographically speaking, they're in the minority. And
is that going to get worse for them? Is the younger generations, is that a problem for the alt-right and Christian nationalism?
Well, it is numbers-wise, right?
Okay.
I don't want to diminish the damage that they can do even from their position as a minority opinion, right? But when you look at polling figures about the 18 to 29-year-old age range, they're extremely, well, first of all, they're the most secular generation that we've ever had, and they're the least white generation that we've ever had, and they're also very anti-Trump.
And they also don't vote.
Well, that's a big issue. I mean, another big issue is obviously like gerrymandering, as you say, also the Electoral College.
Right.
Because Trump did not win the popular vote
not even
in
close.
2016.
Right.
Not even close. Right.
Yeah, so we have all that stuff. I want to be respectful of your time, although I think I could talk about this subject all day. Let me remind the listeners that the new book is Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. And, of course, I'm talking to Sarah Posner. Is there any main themes or topics of the book that we didn't cover that you want to get in, or do you want to put a bow on it and go and do something productive other than talking to me? What are your thoughts at this time?
Well, I think that people who are interested in the book, that it's important to spark people's interest in the book who might be wondering whether they want to buy it or not, is that it looks at how the Christian right and the alt-right came together to support Trump, and that his presidency is revered by the Christian right, even as he caters to what the alt-right has always wanted, the nativism and the racism and the racist policies.
Right.
And the Christian right is fully on board. I think earlier in his presidency, people thought that there were things that he did or said that would offend anyone with Christian values.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, the Christian right has stood behind him throughout all of it, throughout his impeachment, throughout child separation, throughout his statements about Charlottesville, and throughout the pandemic. I mean, he has seen a little bit of erosion in his approval rating from white evangelicals, but a recent Pew survey, which found that erosion in their approval of his handling of the coronavirus, still found that 82% of them plan to vote for him in November. So I think it's really important to understand not just the horse race politics of what's happening right now, but the deep history of race and religion in the conservative movement and the Republican Party that has brought us to this moment. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, because I think, the previous talking points for years, decades, maybe even a couple of generations were about a president having family values. And even though Obama might be one of the best examples of a father, of a husband, of a parent, that's all thrown away when you look at Trump and everything you could imagine going wrong with someone attempting to appeal to people that put interest or value in family values. He's not that person, but yet they love him.
Yes, and a lot of them will say sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader to save a nation from its decline. And that is the excuse that they make for Trump, because he may not appear to be the pious Christian or family man that they had always advocated for, but he is nonetheless, in their view, saving Christian America from the machinations of the left.
Well, and he does things like kind of sort of overriding the Johnson Amendment, which we won't get into because we'll be here all day, appointing judges, and there's a lot of government offices he hasn't even put in an employee or a manager to run it, but there's also a lot of positions, low-level positions, that are being filled by people that are very aligned with Christian nationalism and the alt-right, and not every one of those employees will leave when Trump leaves office.
Well, his political appointees will, right? So, like, in agencies, he appoints not just the cabinet secretary, but there are a lot of other positions that are appointed by the president, and they would leave when he leaves office, as opposed to career civil servants who stay regardless of who the president is.
Fair enough.
But many of these people are making policy right now that would have to be undone or,
And you have to find every policy that was changed to undo it. So that's going to take a lot of work. Unless you have something else you want to cover, again, I want to be respectful of your time. Sarah Posner, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show. And the listeners, of course, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
It's about time to wrap the show up, and of course, I am delighted that you're here. One of the nice things in the secular community that is becoming more common is because we don't have conferences, several of the national organizations, at least, are now having semi-regular, regular, kind of like webcast, webinars, and they're having speakers. Someone that might actually be at a conference, but instead they're setting them up for a 20, 30, 60-minute interview, and you can look for those. I know FFRF does them, American Atheist does them, American Humanist Association, and I think CFI. So if you're feeling that you're missing out on that conference experience, this is not going to necessarily fix that, but it might give you a little something to watch and enjoy if you've got some time to spare and you want to do that. So look up your favorite national secular organization, and you can check that. Of course, the book we talked about, Unholy, special thank you again, Sarah Posner. My apologies for saying the name wrong earlier, Sarah Posner. And again, my apologies to her for the delay in putting up her interview. It was one of those rare times where often I ask 3 or 4 or 5 people to get one positive response for an interview, which can be quite time consuming. And in the last few weeks, I had almost everybody said yes. And then, of course, we had the interview jump up and become available of the United States Representative Jared Huffman. And because of the temporal nature of the comments, some of the stuff we talked about, I felt it was important to do that like the day or the next day of doing that interview. So you're going to love, or hopefully you did love, hearing about the book, but now go buy the book, use your Audible tokens, or buy the actual paper book or Kindle, whatever. It's on all of those formats, and you're going to love it. If you like this show, The Phil Ferguson Show, I would love it if you could go to patreon.com/Phil and kick in a few bucks per show as a sign of your appreciation, or, of course, going to Stitcher or Apple Podcasts and leaving a 5-star review. And that way people find the show and they go, holy crap, this guy has hundreds of 5-star reviews. It really makes a difference when someone's looking for a podcast to see a show with a lot of 5-star reviews. So I thank you. I appreciate it very much. And by special request, a couple people asked me, this episode, after I wrap up and after the end music, there will be no wacky Christian remake or crazy song. This is my gift to you, this episode. Sometimes I put those songs on there, sometimes I don't. Just keeps you guessing. But this time there will not be a special crazy Christian song after the show. So thank you for listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. I am delighted that you're here. And maybe someday in the future, maybe after January 21st, things will be better. And the coronavirus will be in our rearview window, and we'll have the Russian vaccine, and we'll all be better. Until then, ciao.